Mark chapter 12. We got through about half of this chapter last week. To give you an idea of what's going on here in Mark 12, remember that we're getting toward the time of Jesus' crucifixion. He's come to Jerusalem. He's already made his triumphal entry. There's just a few days to go before he's going to be crucified. And interestingly, when Jesus made his triumphal entry, there's a belief that the route he took from the Mount of Olives was the route that they took when they brought in the Passover lamb into the city of Jerusalem that was killed at the temple for all of the people. They had a particular lamb, and they would bring it about a week before, and they would tie it to a post there at the temple. And the people had all week that they could come by and examine the lamb because it had to be spotless and without blemish. And so you could come and you could look at that lamb. Well, there's a belief that Jesus followed the same path that that lamb did, and Jesus also went to the temple. And the final week before he was crucified was spent in being examined by the people. Especially you read here about them asking him questions, trying to find fault in him. And so this is what's going on here in Mark chapter 12. They're starting to ask him questions. The first one we talked about last week was the Pharisees and the Herodians made an alliance together to come and try and catch Jesus and try and make him say something that was treasonous against the Roman Empire, which was that don't pay taxes. That would have been enough to get Jesus arrested and maybe even put to death as a traitor. And so they wanted the Romans to do their dirty work, so the Herodians and the Pharisees got together and said, let's go ask him a question. We'll pretend like we really like him and that we're sincerely wanting to know these answers to these questions. And we'll ask him whether it's right to pay tribute or taxes to Caesar. Well, that goes all the way back to when Jesus was born. The reason why they were in Bethlehem, Mary and Joseph, was because they were taking a census for taxation purposes, to make sure they had everybody enrolled in Israel to pay taxes to Rome. And so the Herodians were a group that was more of a political party, and their whole idea was that, well, the Romans are here, we really don't want to be directly ruled by the Romans. So Herod and his family, Herod the Great and his descendants, had converted to Judaism. They were Edomites, descendants of Esau, but they had converted to Judaism so that they could climb during the time of the Jewish independence, just before the New Testament period. During that time, they wanted to climb up the national political scene, so they became Jews really in word only. Of course, they had to learn certain things as Jews, and so they had a familiarity with the law and with the prophets that would be brought up. Paul would bring it up to one of the Herods, you know what the prophets say. And so they had some understanding. So the Herodians wanted the Herods. They said, well, that's the best we can do. Let's support Herod's descendants. Then we don't have to deal directly with Rome. We can just really operate as an independent nation with the Herods in charge, and we'll just pay our taxes and be done with it. No fighting. And of course the Pharisees, that wasn't what they were interested in. They were just interested in getting rid of Jesus. They didn't like him because he pointed out the inconsistencies and the things that they did. He's going to continue to do that up until the time they kill him. So they made this pact together to try and get him to say that paying taxes wasn't right. When they asked him about paying taxes, they figured one of two things would happen. If he said, pay your taxes, the people would turn on him. And if he said, don't pay your taxes, the Romans would turn on him. And so when they asked him, he just said, bring me a coin, a Roman coin. And they brought the Roman coin, and they had the image on the coin. He said, well, whose image is that? He says, well, they said, it's Caesar's. He says, give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar. He said, give to God what belongs to God. That's what Jesus was here to do. Give to God what belongs to him. And you remember that just came right after that parable of the vineyard, where the master of the vineyard came and said, sent a servant and said, give what belongs to the master. Give unto him the glory and the obedience that you promised him and that under covenant and he deserves, give it to him, and they refused to do it and killed the son. So they were thwarted in their efforts to try and get him to say something treasonous because he said, give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar. But then he turned it around and says, I'm here to tell you to give to God what belongs to God. And so the people liked that answer. They weren't against him. He said, I'm not here for political reasons. I'm here to tell you spiritual things that you need to give God what belongs to God. And all that other stuff will take care of itself. So then that's where we get into tonight. And it says in verse 18, then come unto him the Sadducees. All right, so you had the Herodians and the Pharisees. Well, the Pharisees' counterparts in the religious world were the Sadducees. Those two groups controlled the entire religious and political system. They were the teachers, they were the priests. The Sadducees especially were in charge of the high priesthood. And they had real religious differences. And one of them was that they didn't believe in angels, which I find interesting because that's why I tell people God has a sense of humor. When the Sadducees put the apostles in prison, God sent an angel to let them out. And so when they brought them before the Sadducees and said, how'd you get out? He said, an angel sent me. Well, we don't believe in angels. God could have done it in a number of ways, but he sent an angel. So they could say, an angel did it. So I see the sense of humor of God in that. So they didn't believe in angels. The second thing they didn't believe in was they didn't believe in the resurrection. It says here, then come unto him the Sadducees, which say there is no resurrection. And the reason they didn't believe in a resurrection was because they only believed that the first 5 books of the Old Testament were valuable for law and doctrine. Prophets, that's fine, that's great and everything. The scribes, they knew all about it. The lawyers, they knew all about what the prophets said and wrote. But as far as God's law, they were only concerned with the books of the law: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. That's all. And they reasoned in their mind that since there was no resurrection mentioned in Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, that there must not be a resurrection. And I had a teacher in Bible college, and this wasn't original to him, but he would say, I remember him getting up in chapel service one day and saying, the Sadducees did not believe in a resurrection. That's why they were sad, you see. Ta-ta. But they didn't believe in that, so here's what they thought. They thought in themselves, one, if there's no life after this one, and this is all there is, then the sign that you are blessed of God is your monetary gain. So they were wealthy, they had money, and they tried to get money. They weren't trying to hide that. They were some of the ones that tried to bring probably into the New Testament church the idea of gain as godliness, and probably some of them that came in that brought the idea of no resurrection that Paul talked about in 1 Corinthians 15. They didn't believe in a resurrection because it wasn't mentioned in the first 5 books of the Bible. So they're going to catch Jesus in his speech because, they know he believes in a resurrection. So they come to him and they say, Master, Moses wrote unto us, if a man's brother die and leave his wife behind and leave no children, that his brother should take his wife and raise up seed unto his brother. So in other words, if you've got a man that's married and he dies before having any children, then under the law, the brother would marry the widow and have children in his brother's name so that they can be heirs of his brother and they can carry on the brother's name. And so he said that's what the law says. And says, now there were 7 brothers, 7 brethren. And the first took a wife, and dying left no seed, had no children. So the second took her, and he died, neither left he any seed. So the brother took and married her, and he didn't have any children. So then the third one took her. And then he says in verse 22, and the 7 had her, and left no seed. All of them, all the brothers were married to the same woman, and none of them had any children. So here was their question. Last of all, the woman died also. In the resurrection, therefore, when they shall rise, whose wife shall she be of them? For the 7 had her to wife. So when the resurrection comes and she's been married to all 7 men, which one of them can claim her as their wife when they get to heaven? Which one's going to have her? So they thought they had him, It's silly to believe that there's a resurrection, because how does it make sense? How's this woman going to be married to 7 different men? Who's going to claim her as their spouse of the 7? And Jesus answering said to them, Do ye not therefore err, because ye know not the Scriptures, neither the power of God? The power of God to raise people from the dead. You don't believe in a resurrection. What makes you think that God can't raise somebody from the dead and give them everlasting life? You don't know the power of God. And he says, and you're in error because you don't know the Scriptures either. And so now he's going to point out where they erred in Scripture. For when they shall rise from the dead, they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are as the angels which are in heaven. In other words, once you get to heaven, there's no marrying. You're free once you get to heaven. Babs hadn't shouted in years. Look at her shouting. There be no marriage when you get to heaven. And I've mentioned before, one of the things about that is that I don't think people understand the purity of the love that's going to exist in heaven. That we are all going to be at such a level of affection for each other, such a tight-knit family. But there's no levels of it. I just think that that's unnecessary. So Jesus said, you're talking about who's going to be married to who. Marriage is until death. After death, it's done. And there is no marriage after that. But Babs is still going to hang out with me.
I don't think so.
Yes, she is too. So Jesus tells them you're in error because you think that there's marriage after this life. There is no marriage after this life. They're like the angels. The angels don't marry. And so we're going to be like the angels. And so then he goes on and he says, and as touching the dead, that they rise. Now notice what he does. They're not going to listen to him if he quotes to them from Job, right? Because Job talks about, in my flesh, though worms devour my body, yet in my flesh I shall see God. He's not going to talk about the resurrection that talks about in the prophets, the resurrection of the just and the contemptible as well, that Jesus quotes. So they're not interested in hearing what the prophets say. So Jesus doesn't use the prophets. He uses the first 5 books of the Bible. He says, as touching the dead that they rise, have ye not read in the book of Moses, how in the bush God spake unto him, saying, now this is the burning bush, right? Saying, he introduced himself this way, I am the God of Abraham, and the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. He didn't say, Jesus pointed out, God didn't say, I was the God of Abraham. I was the God of Isaac. I was the God of Jacob. Jesus points out, he says, I am the God of Abraham. I am the God of Isaac. I am the God of Jacob. Now, this is 400 years since Abraham's been alive. But he says, I'm still his God. He's still alive. And I preached this a while back, where even in Luke 16, when the rich man lifted up his eyes in hell, he saw Abraham, with Lazarus next to him. And so Jesus was saying, God was saying, Abraham's alive. He said, I am. And then he says, he is not the God of the dead, but the God of the living. Ye therefore do greatly err. The idea that you think this is all there is to life is a great error. Not just an error, it's a great error. Which is what Paul addresses at the first half of, the whole chapter of 1 Corinthians 15. It's a great error not to believe that there's no resurrection. Now here's the Sadducees and their thinking. One of the things they thought was, the sign that you are godly is the amount of things you possess. The other thing they thought in their minds was, they were sanctimonious in the idea that they said, We don't do good because there's going to be a resurrection and a reward after this life. We do good for the sake of doing good. And that's why really you ought to do good, is for the sake of doing good. So really our hearts are purer than our brothers the Pharisees, because they are doing what they're doing because they believe in rewards after this life. We do it for the pure pleasure of doing what is right and what is good. Well, it wasn't nothing to any of that. You know, there is the hope that we have of eternal life and the reward to come that keeps us going. The idea of saying, well, that sounds real good, you know, well, I'm just